Napoleon, the rise and fall of an emperor. On a warm summer day in 1769, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His family was noble, but they weren't rich. Growing up on this wild, mountainous island, young Napoleon dreamed of something bigger. At just 9 years old, he left home for France to attend military school. The other boys made fun of his Corsican accent and his small size, but Napoleon didn't care. He buried himself in books, history, war, strategy, and promised himself that one day, the world would know his name. Years later, France was in chaos. The revolution had begun, and the old order was crumbling. Napoleon, now a young officer, saw his chance. When British forces took the port city of Toulon, he stepped forward with a daring plan. His brilliant tactics won the battle, and suddenly, everyone in the army knew his name. The revolution had found its first great soldier, but danger wasn't just on the battlefield. In 1795, royalists rose up in Paris, threatening to overthrow the revolutionary government. The leaders were desperate until they called on Napoleon. With a single command to fire with grape shot, he turned his cannons on the mob. The streets ran red, but the rebellion was crushed. France was saved, and Napoleon became a hero. Yet Napoleon wasn't just a soldier, he was a man with a heart. At a party in Paris, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a beautiful and charming widow. He fell madly in love, though she was older and more experienced in the ways of high society. Napoleon didn't care. They married in 1796, and though their love would later become complicated, in those early days, she was his greatest supporter. With Josephine by his side, Napoleon was ready for his next move, conquering Europe. France was at war, and Napoleon, now a general, was given command of a ragged, starving army in Italy. No one expected much from him, but they were wrong. With lightning speed, he led his men across the Alps and smashed the Austrian forces. Battle after battle, he won, cities fell, treaties were signed. By 1797, Napoleon had conquered Italy and returned to Paris as a national hero. The people cheered his name, but for him, this was only the beginning. Hungry for more glory, Napoleon set his sights on Egypt. He wanted to cripple Britain's trade and bring French power to the ancient world. His army fought fierce battles under the desert sun, and though they won victories, disaster struck. The British Navy destroyed his fleet, trapping him in Egypt. But Napoleon wasn't just a soldier, he was a thinker. He brought scholars with him to study Egypt's secrets. And there, in the sands, they found something incredible: the Rosetta Stone, the key to unlocking hieroglyphs. Yet, as word reached him of France's crumbling government, he made a bold choice. Leaving his army behind, he slipped past British ships and raced back home. France was in chaos again. The government, called the Directory, was weak and corrupt. Napoleon knew it was time to act. On a cold November day, the 18th of Brumaire, he staged a coup. Soldiers loyal to him stormed the chambers. Politicians shouted. Some even fainted. But when the dust settled, Napoleon stood at the top. He became first consul, the most powerful man in France. The revolution was over, and a new era had begun. 5 years later, in 1804, Napoleon decided France needed more than a leader, it needed an emperor. In a grand ceremony, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The message was clear: no one gave him power, he took it himself. Josephine, now his empress, watched as the crowd roared. Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy from Corsica, now ruled an empire. Europe's kings had formed an alliance against France. They called themselves the Third Coalition, and they meant to crush Napoleon once and for all. But at Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon proved why he was the greatest general of his age. He tricked his enemies into attacking where he wanted them, then smashed their armies between his own forces and the frozen lakes. By afternoon, the Austrians and Russians were running for their lives. That night, watching the sunset over the battlefield, Napoleon told his men, "This is the finest day of my life." The world would remember Austerlitz as his masterpiece. But one enemy still stood strong: Britain. Since he couldn't defeat their navy, Napoleon tried to strangle their trade. He ordered all Europe to stop buying British goods. This continental system was supposed to bring England to its knees. Instead, it made everyone miserable. French merchants lost money. Ordinary people couldn't get tea or cotton. Even Napoleon's own family cheated the system. The plan was backfiring, but the emperor refused to admit defeat. In Spain, things were going terribly wrong. Napoleon had put his brother on the Spanish throne, thinking the people would accept French rule. Instead, they rose up in fury. Farmers became fighters, priests led rebel bands, and the British sent an army to help. This wasn't war as Napoleon knew it, no grand battles, just endless stabbing in the dark. His best troops were bleeding away in this peninsular war, but he couldn't let go. The Spanish ulcer, as he called it, kept spreading. Then came the greatest gamble of all. In 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Russians refused to fight, instead drawing him deeper and deeper into their land. When they finally reached Moscow, the city was empty, then it burned to the ground. With winter coming and no food, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. The journey back became a nightmare. Men froze where they stood. Horses were eaten raw. Of the mighty Grand Army, only a shattered remnant returned. After the disaster in Russia, all of Europe smelled blood. The kings and emperors Napoleon had humiliated years before now united against him. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, they all marched with one goal: to destroy France's emperor once and for all. The final showdown came at Leipzig in October 1813. For 3 terrible days, nearly 600,000 soldiers clashed in what would be called the Battle of Nations. Napoleon fought like a cornered lion, but the numbers were too great. When a bridge blew up too early, trapping thousands of his men, the defeat turned into a rout. The emperor barely escaped with his life as his empire crumbled around him. By spring 1814, enemy armies entered Paris. With no other choice, Napoleon signed his abdication. The victors showed him mercy of a sort. They made him ruler of Elba, a little island off Italy's coast. For 10 months, he played at being king of this tiny kingdom, building roads and reviewing his few hundred soldiers. But as he watched from his island, he saw France's new king was unpopular, and the victorious allies were already quarreling among themselves. The fire in his heart began to burn again. Then came the most daring move of his life. With just a handful of men, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France. The king sent armies to stop him, but every soldier sent to arrest him instead joined him. Within weeks, he was back in Paris, the king fleeing in his nightshirt. Europe's rulers gasped in horror. The Corsican ogre had returned. They immediately declared war, gathering their forces near Brussels. Napoleon knew he had to strike fast. The final battle came at Waterloo. For hours, Napoleon's army battered the British under Wellington. It nearly worked, but then the Prussians arrived. As evening fell, the French army collapsed into panic and retreat. Napoleon had gambled everything ... and lost. This time, there would be no negotiations. The British sent him to St. Helena, a barren island in the middle of nowhere. Here, under constant watch, Napoleon spent his last years reliving his glory days, telling his story to anyone who would listen. The man who had once ruled Europe now measured time by the changing light on his prison walls. In 1821, at just 51 years old, he died. Some say from stomach cancer, others whisper of poison, but his legend was just beginning. Napoleon was gone, but his shadow stretched long across Europe. The fiery young general who had crowned himself emperor left behind more than just battlefields and broken thrones. He left ideas, powerful ones that would shape the world long after his death. His greatest gift, the Napoleonic Code. Before Napoleon, laws were messy, different in every region, full of old feudal rules. He swept all that away. For the first time, laws were clear, written down, the same for everyone. Well, almost everyone. Men gained rights, but women lost some. Still, this code spread across Europe and even to America, becoming the foundation for modern law. The idea that everyone should be equal before the law, that started here. War would never be the same after Napoleon either. Before him, armies moved like chess pieces, polite and slow. He turned war into something fast, brutal, and total. His strategies are still taught in military schools today. The way he used artillery, how he inspired his troops, even his mistakes are studied. The little corporal became the father of modern warfare, but perhaps his most surprising legacy was the spread of revolution itself. Though Napoleon became an emperor, he carried the revolution's fire across Europe. Kings trembled as their people remembered his promise of merit over birthright. The genie of nationalism and reform couldn't be put back in the bottle. Within decades of his death, revolutions would sweep Europe again, this time inspired by the very ideas Napoleon had spread. The boy from Corsica, who wanted to be remembered, got his wish. 200 years later, we still debate him, tyrant or visionary. Warmonger or reformer, maybe he was all these things. But one thing's certain, Napoleon Bonaparte changed the world, and the world has never forgotten.